Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Sunday service with the Atheist Reformation. I'm your host, Drew. Joining me today, once again, is, of course, my co host, Harry. How are you doing today, Harry?
I'm doing all right. Finally able to go outside again.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
That's good. So, in looking at everything today, we've got a few interesting stories to cover, and I do apologize I'm messing with my microphone a little bit. I'm just trying to make sure I've got it in the best spot, that way everybody can hear me.
I also like seeing it. It's got like a nice feel to have it right there.
Yeah, it kind of does. I'll give it that.
It's a beautiful mic.
Uh, it really wasn't even all that expensive either. Like for good quality condenser microphones, you do not have to break the bank. So be aware. I think this microphone through Lewitt, and I'm not endorsed by them, far from it. I mean, I don't think anyone's going to endorse a channel that's only got 71 subscribers, but that is growth. I am happy about it. We're up from last week. We were at 64 subscribers. Now we're at 71, so that's 7 new people that have joined the fray. And of course, both Harry and I appreciate it. And whether you came over here from watching the Sunday service or the Discussions with Atheist show, I'm glad that you're here. And I look forward to providing more content for you in the future, which some of that we are going to discuss towards the end of the show today. So please stay tuned and keep an eye out, because we do have what I think is going to be a fun, or at least interesting, announcement to make as to the future of the Atheist Reformation and what we're going to be doing. As always, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, after you subscribe, please click that notification bell icon right next to it so that you're notified when we're going to be going live, what we're going to be doing, and when we start releasing more regular pre-recorded content. You'll be able to see when that pops up too. As always, the articles are going to be linked in the video description down below. And if you want to be on the show, either Discussions with the Theist, or you have an idea for an article that we should cover on the Sunday service, or you have an idea for a recorded show that you're not able to do yourself, or you just don't want to be on YouTube, whatever the case may be, just something you find interesting that goes with the flow and the theme of the channel, please feel free to shoot me an email at theatheistreformation@gmail.com. I do check it pretty much daily. Sometimes I do go about 2 days without checking it when my day job gets in the way. All right, so I think that should about cover everything for right now. So I'd say we're gonna go ahead and jump into the fray on these videos. What do you think, Harry?
I think it sounds like a good idea.
All righty. Well, let's see. So first things first, we're going to talk about a couple of Indian priests that were murdered in Uttar Pradesh. This should be a pretty short story, so we'll get the more depressing things out of the way quickly. Although, I don't know, people may find all the stories today depressing, but we're here, they're here, we're going to cover them. Two sadhus, these are priests, are killed inside a Bulandshahr temple in Uttar Pradesh, accused, arrested. So it looks like whoever has done this, or at least has been accused of doing this, has been arrested. The Uttar Pradesh police has arrested a man for killing 2 priests inside a temple in Bulandshahr on Tuesday. Police said the accused murdered the sadhus using a sharp-edged weapon over an altercation he had with them a few days back. So, it seems as though this does not have anything to do with the other issue.
Um, on
The
on
Palgar
its
mob
surface,
lynching.
doesn't really have anything to do with it. The only
Mm-hmm.
thing that's related to it is kind of the effect that it's had, and the coverage of it is a little bit
Okay.
different. That's relevant.
Okay. So, we'll get right into it. They do reference the Palgar mob lynching incident, which was a sad thing that happened to those 2 individuals. And of course, we hope that justice is brought to those who murdered really anyone. I mean, so police have arrested a man in connection with the killings of the 2 sadhus inside of the temple. The accused killed the 2 sadhus following an altercation over stealing their chimtas, a form of tongs, a few days back, police say. The incident came to light after mutilated bodies of, I won't I won't do any try to do any injustice to the dead by mispronouncing the names. So we're gonna move on. They lived in the temple at Pagona Village in Anupshahar, and they were discovered by villagers on Tuesday morning when they arrived at the temple to pay obeisance. Or obeisance? I can never remember how to pronounce that. To my knowledge, that's the same thing as tithing in the Christian faith.
More or less, yeah. It's kind of like whenever you go to uh, whenever you go to the wow, my mind has just gone completely blank. What do Catholics call church?
Mass?
But not when they're having mass, just when it's open. Like when people go to pray or they light a candle, but they're not actually having a service.
Oh, that's just the cathedral's open.
Yeah, like it's more like when people go to the cathedral at random times throughout the day. It's kind of like that.
Okay, so this is basically a way that they leave offerings and stuff like that.
Yeah,
Okay, okay, so this is more of a daily missive of sorts.
for some people, yeah. Some people weekly. It's just
Okay,
whatever.
all right. So according to police, the man killed the two sadhus over an altercation he had had with them a few days back after he took away their tongs. I don't know the significance of the tongs. I'm assuming there is some sort of religious significance to them because apparently he was scolded after he snatched them. And according to this police officer, I'm assuming here, the individual was angered by this and the accused killed them both.
So I'm going to translate this into something that in East Texas we would all be aware of. And I'm not doing this to make light of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm doing it to show how tragic it is, but also how relatable this is. It
Okay.
would be the equivalent of if someone got drunk, broke into a church, and stole the tambourines. And as he was leaving, if the priest came out and basically scolded him publicly
Mm-hmm.
for stealing their tambourines.
Okay.
That's the tongs are a musical, significant part of worship and part of prayer. So they operate almost the exact same way. And apparently,
Okay.
the guy went home, got angry, came back, and murdered the priests or monks. And the only conflict here is the people say that he had a sword and stabbed them, like slaughtered them with a sword. And he says that he just beat them with a stick to kill them.
Okay. Yes, it says here, according to police, the sadhus were murdered using a sharp weapon, and they also added that the matter is still under investigation. The murder of sadhus in Uttar Pradesh comes after three persons, including two sadhus, were lynched in Palghar, Maharashtra, while they were on their way to a funeral in neighboring Silvassa. And they talk about that incident again, and so we're not gonna rehash that one. We covered that one last week. I do encourage everybody to go back and watch that. We got our first comment tuning in from KCA_Randy. Says it'll take time, but when something goes a bit viral, your subs will explode. Well, Randy, I appreciate the thought, and I thank you for tuning in this evening. I really appreciate it. And looking forward to seeing more from you in the future. Figured I'd go ahead and address that while we're kind of transitioning from one story to the next.
Yeah. So the only, I guess, real thing that the only real issue that this kind of brings up related to the other one is that the particular area where this crime happened is a heavily Hindu area. There's not really any tribal or Muslim majority in that area or significant population. And it's just a very big difference in how the media covered it in
Right.
terms of, instead of just focusing on, in the other story, how tragic it was that these two religious people were murdered. There was no accusation or discussion of this being motivated by religion. It was very much this one-off guy that was just doing something very stupid and cruel and terrible.
And so it would seem. Just the way they're covering it, yes, this seems to be like it's a run-of-the-mill everyday type story. while they're covering other things in almost a cover-up light to some degree,
Yeah.
or a more, not necessarily acerbic, what's the word I'm searching for here? More politicized method of coverage.
Definitely more politicized. Like there's some kind of agenda going on to the murders, and in this case, it's a terrible, evil, stupid person stole a musical instrument and got angry about being called out about it.
Exactly. So let's move on to our next uh, story. This one's a bit more lighthearted, so hopefully that'll help with some things here. This comes to us from the Irish Times, and it's talking about how non-religious weddings, or I'm just going to call it atheist weddings, are almost the same as Catholic as far as their figures are showing when they look at the numbers, anyways.
Huh.
So, the CSO data shows 43.6% of ceremonies Catholic compared with 41% either civil or humanist. So, anything non religious seems to fall into this category. And also, I don't know if they use the word humanist in place of atheist, but humanism and atheism are not necessarily the same thing. There are a lot of atheists who are secular humanists. There are even secular humanists who are not atheists. It seems a little odd, but there is a distinction. So, non-religious weddings in Ireland are approaching parity with those which take place in the Catholic Church, according to latest figures released by the Central Statistics Office. Figures for 2019 show the couples choosing to be married in the Catholic Church accounted for 43.6% of Irish marriages in 2019, compared to the 41% who opted for a non-religious ceremony, this being civil and humanist, so anything that is not specifically Catholic or religious. Catholic marriages in Ireland accounted for roughly 48% in 2018, 51% in 2017, and almost 54% in 2016. In fact, their equivalent figure in 1990 was 93.2%. So, this
Wow.
is a very big decline. Now, granted, this is taking place over the course of approximately 30 years at this point. That being said, to cut in half, cut more than half actually, with it being 43.6%. Now, as of 2019, in less than 30 years, that shows evidence of a big change, a big societal and cultural change in that region. So, this should be really interesting going forward.
I wonder if the numbers might have been inflated due to civil conflict. Because typically, if there's conflict going on,
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to go through the trouble of getting married unless it's kind of part of your strongly held religious beliefs that it's required.
True, that is a thing. However, just in the last 5 years, we have seen a decent uptick in the average ages of grooms and brides as well.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, from 2014, the average age of a bride is 33 and 35 for a groom, but now today, roughly 35 and 37. So people are getting married later in life. So people seem to be focusing more on personal growth and development, possibly university education and career building at first, and so working on that financial independence and stability before seeking out a relationship. And I think that's a tune that just about anybody can dance to. Making sure
Well,
you're able to adequately care for yourself before trying to uh, go the next step, even if you're boyfriend and girlfriend, going the next step towards marriage and things like that. That's my personal opinion on it. If you fall in love with somebody, whoever he, she, or anything in between may be, and if you really just got to get married, as long as you're legally able to, I say go for it. However, there are I'm not going to say it's a better way to go about it. I will say it is a more fiscally intelligent way to go about it.
Yeah, the flip side to that is whether people are doing this because they're making smart decisions for future family, or whether they're stuck in consumer culture and they just want to assume.
Well, see, that's the thing. That would be hard to kind of parse out there. I would say we would need to look at um, employment, average pay data, and things of that nature to really kind of get into the weeds on something like that to determine to what level or for what reason this age seems to be going up.
Yeah.
And also, I would like to see the divorce rate there as well to see if there has been an increase, an uptick, or even a decrease in that, because
That's a good point.
just about anything
What
is
if
possible.
what if like the age rates just are increasing because people are just getting remarried older and older and older, and
I mean,
before
that
you
is possible.
80-year-olds on their sixth marriage.
Oh, what was that joke? It was a Robin Williams joke way back in the day, talking about how after marriage number three, both parties should have to be forced to give up a body part. And he made a joke about Larry King by this point would be nothing but a head on a stick. I mean, hey. Also, there is some interesting statistics on that, at least as far as divorce goes. Um, the divorce rate is is higher, at least in the United States, is higher in the religious community than it is in the atheist community. Like,
Yeah.
or the divorce rates are sharply contrasted, even though we're constantly told, constantly bombarded, especially by religious organizations, that a religious marriage that's built on faith, on God, religion, and this and that and all that other fun stuff to some people, that's uh, the path to success for any marriage. But we're seeing that that's not actually the case.
What's the overall actual marriage rates though? Isn't it substantially lower?
In the atheist community,
Yeah.
um, I do not remember off the top of my head. I'd have to go back and look at that.
Because
I just remember the divorce rate was quite a bit lower.
in the
But also
religious.
the ages were higher. The average ages were higher in the atheist community.
Hmm.
So there is possibly something to be said for uh, mental maturity coming with life experience as well. There is that possibility.
Or whenever you're younger, there is definitely pressure to go ahead and get married if you are in.
In some religious cultures, yes, definitely.
Yeah. Well, the religious culture I'm from, that is definitely the case. If you've been in a relationship for a few years, like the family starts asking both of you, what's wrong with the other person?
Wow. Or what's wrong with you?
Yeah.
So going through here, um, based on these recent figures, advocacy group Education Equality has urgently called on the government to compel schools to confine religious instruction to a period outside core school hours. This, it said, would uphold the constitutional and human rights of all families to freedom of religion and belief. Police officer Patty Monahan asked, how much evidence does the government need before it responds to the calls for change from parents the length and breadth of the country? It was time for schools to respect and celebrate diversity. There is a widening disconnect between our denominational school system and the actual beliefs of young families, he said. That's an interesting take towards the end of that story.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I'm inclined to agree with them. I mean, I'm all for secular education, for actually having a separation between church and state. This isn't always the case in several of the countries. However, we do seem to do better as a society, at least as far as advancements in economics from what we've seen thus far, when we have that separation. It seems to yield some of the best results. because there is, by necessity, more freedom in that way. Which, even if it's not always the absolute best outcome, I'm still going to err on the side of freedom.
Yeah.
But that's just my political views on things. So that is neither here nor there.
I'm going to be honest. I definitely zoned out for just a second because I realized that there's a joke about religious, well, about like a religious mom that's like, when are you going to have grandbabies? I want to be a grandmother.
Oh my gosh.
And I realized that joke is universal because every single religion that I've ever seen in
Has
every
some form of that somewhere in there.
that same tone of voice is consistent. It doesn't matter what religion it is. There's always the mom that's like, when am I going to be a grandparent?
It has that simpering tone.
Yes.
Anyways, my little brother has joined us once again for the live stream. Hello, Matthew. Thank you for tuning in. Always appreciated. We're about to get into some of the more gritty stories, I would call it, or at least the more hotly contested ones from his side of the fence.
Oh, okay. My side? Or your brother's
Your side.
Oh, my
Your
side.
Well, I would say they're hotly contested on both sides. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a Supreme Court case about it. However, that's not the one we're going to just yet.
Okay.
So the next one we're going to be covering today is going to be a question. More exemptions? Or actually, no, correction. Where's the separation? That, I think, is one of the real questions here.
Okay.
This from the AmericanAtheist.org, saying that Congress authorizes another unconstitutional giveaway for religious worship in latest coronavirus stimulus. So, let's take a look at it. Today, the religious equality watchdog organization, American Atheists, condemned Congress's failure to include necessary constitutional protections in the $484 billion aid bill passed by the House of Representatives. As a result, the additional $310 billion injected into the Small Business Association's Paycheck Protection Program can unconstitutionally fund religious worship. Congress must first include these First Amendment protections in any future stimulus bills, particularly after the Small Business Administration weakened its own regulations, allowing the original $350 billion in stimulus money to fund religious worship. This comes from Allison Gill, the Vice President for Legal and Policy at American Atheists. Long-standing SBA, that's Small Business Administration, regulations have prevented businesses principally engaged in teaching, instructing, counseling, or indoctrinating religion or religious beliefs, whether in a religious or secular setting, from receiving business or economic disaster loans. However, with its guidance on the Paycheck Protection Program from the CARES Act, SBA suddenly indicated in early April that it would decline to enforce these subsections. If the SBA won't do its job and protect the Constitution, Congress must finally step in, says President of American Atheists, Nick Fish. Congress is rushing to replenish Paycheck Protection Program funds after countless businesses were unable to access these loans to preserve jobs. What we don't know is how many well-heeled megachurches were able to secure government money to pay their pastor's salary, while small businesses were essentially left out in the cold. Thousands and thousands of our supporters have warned Congress that these stimulus bills fail to adequately protect the constitutional separation of religion and government, said Gill. Accountability, transparency, and adherence to the Constitution are critical, especially in the face of a crisis. Now, without looking too deep into this, I'm actually inclined to agree with Allison Gill and Nick Fish on this. Because
I'm inclined to disagree. No surprise.
Right.
So
yeah. Mega churches, places like the Copelands, Joel Osteen, they should not qualify for this at all.
I will agree with that.
I don't think any church should qualify for this
I
because
just
they are not businesses.
So the purpose of the CARES Act isn't to keep a business running. What we're talking about here is
No, this is not just the 480. This is not straightforward the 484 billion. This is the additional 310 billion that was injected specifically into the SBA's Paycheck Protection Program. So that is
right,
something entirely separate from the CARES Act. CARES Act authorized funds to be injected into SBA.
right. So
So
this is
this so anything under SBA PPP should not be going to any religious institution.
so what you got. One of the things we got to remember is that the original money that was authorized to go to the small business grants, that was zeroed out within like a couple of days.
Yeah.
It was gone because a lot of companies somehow got themselves approved as small businesses when they clearly were not. And
Mm-hmm.
we've seen the news articles about that. I believe Shake Shack was publicly shamed for it, for getting
As
10
well,
million
they
dollars,
flippin' should have.
and then they gave it back. Taco Cabana, Potbelly Subs. I'm going to list all of them because
I'll
I'm
list
not.
all of them. All of those assholes need to be put on blast. I'll even
Yeah.
say it again. Shake Shack, you should be ashamed of yourself.
Now they
Trying
did give it
to.
back.
You did give it back, but the fact that you had the gall to weasel your way into taking it in the first place makes you a grade A asshole.
So one of the things that I'm looking at this is I think it's disingenuous to say that this money is going to what was the wording that they used, to pay for religious indoctrination?
No, it
Because
says that because of SBA weakening its own regulations voluntarily, that this can unconstitutionally fund religious worship. Not that it will, not that it has, but that the danger is there.
so the the practicality of that, I do understand the argument that if you allow something today, it means that you set a precedent for the future.
Precisely.
Now, the practicality is that these funds are not going to further worship because no one is attending churches right now. There's some online and there's some other methods of churches. But what we're talking about is not just, a pastor at a country church. That's all it is a church. A lot of those
Mm-hmm.
preachers are otherwise employed. We're talking about churches that have multiple employees, janitorial staff, cooks, that they have child care providing, that they have secretaries, librarians. Those people do receive paychecks, even if it's for not a full 40 hours worth of work. They do
Right.
receive paychecks, and a lot of times that income is what they use to pay for their bills, their housing, their food, whatever. So I understand the concern about not wanting to use federal funds to pay for religious practice, but the reality of this is there are people that if you don't give them,
Well, see, here's the thing, though. Here's the thing.
okay,
Those individual people, if they're filing taxes, if they're doing all the things they should be doing from the get-go, they still qualified for the $1,200 stimulus.
not necessarily. Retired people that are not making enough money would not qualify for the $1,200 stimulus.
Right. There
Retire
were
on
some
that.
pretty specific caveats to it. I understand that. I'm just saying that in general.
But even then, $1,200 may not be enough to pay for your rent and your food and your
It
bill.
may not, but there again, if we're talking about part-time hours, and let's face it, working for any church, from what I've seen and from what I've heard from personal experience, they don't pay well. In fact, they generally pay below average.
So that
and,
would
and quite a bit below average
that would
based
go
on
further.
some of the data available.
They wouldn't be using as much money because they wouldn't be able to request as much money for paycheck protection. In an
Right.
ideal situation, as long as it's not a mega church pastor that's getting paid $250,000 a year or something. But then at that point, I don't think they should qualify for a small business loan.
No, absolutely not.
I'm
But
more
it's
worried.
also talking about there has been long-standing regulation with the SBA, and it even says it right here, uh, preventing businesses principally engaged in teaching, instructing, counseling, or indoctrinating religion or religious beliefs, whether in a religious or secular setting, from receiving business or economic disaster loans.
Yeah, I
So,
do.
my question with that would be is obviously this would not include somewhere like Hobby Lobby. It wouldn't even this wouldn't even include Mardell's Christian Bookstore. They would not be labeled under this clause. So the actual, well, unless they're not a small business, obviously.
Yeah,
Uh, but
I, this would include things like churches that operate 7 days a week, and that have support staff. There are large enough churches. I used to go to one that they had on-site staff, either drivers, janitorial staff. Um, they had security or attendants that were there. They would probably had about 15 or 20 total employees, and of those, probably a dozen or less worked a full 40 hours.
okay, so my thing with that would be since the churches are effectively not operating during this crisis and whatnot, um, is there not a way for them to continue to pay their people, their support staff? I mean, they're obviously saving money and paying lower electric bills and this, that, and the other, not having to do other certain things as well.
A lot of churches don't have like saved up revenue. When tithes are not being paid, the revenue has completely stopped. If they're not having people show up to pay tithes in person, now the mega churches, they do have online tithing set up. Some people do have recurring payments for the people
Mm-hmm.
who are larger contributors. But if people aren't showing up in the sanctuary and paying tithes, that's going to be a huge cut right there. And a lot of churches, they don't really spend that much money on electrical and things like that. Most of the money, because most of their electric use is only going to happen three times out of the week: Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and depending
Mm-hmm.
upon your denomination.
Yeah. But
Mainly
also
for
these
service.
larger churches that are running 7 days a week generally have their lights running 24/7. A lot of them do.
I suppose. Yeah, I guess what I'm thinking of is where there is landscaping that is involved. I know that's another example.
Mm-hmm.
And you're probably going to continue to do the landscaping, so you really wouldn't need paycheck protection there. Well,
Well,
you
on
would
top, of that, landscaping is generally not done by the church or by support staff. That's usually something that is contracted out
yes, and I think that's
to
what
a
we're
local
talking about
business owner.
is the contracted labor. I think that's a big part of it as well.
Right, but still, these are all issues of contracted labor. If it's contracted labor, then this still shouldn't apply because these are not direct employees of that church.
That's a good point. Yeah.
So these are employees of a third-party organization that are providing services via
That,
contract to this religious organization,
and that third party organization would qualify. So that would be for churches
depending on
that,
their status, obviously.
yeah, that do first party, like direct hire of the landscaping personnel or crew.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think we've beaten this dead horse enough on this one, I think.
Yeah.
So I would say it's time to move on to the big disagreement between us tonight, I think. And this is going to be over a Supreme Court case. And I've just called this one More Exemptions? Really?
Yeah, I'm going to take the coward's way out and say we'll just wait and see what the Supreme Court says for my
I
official.
mean, we will wait and we will have to wait and see what SCOTUS says,
Yeah.
but we're going to cover it.
Yeah.
So, this is another story from American Atheist. This one's from a little earlier in the month since we haven't pulled a lot from them lately. And this is Little Sister's Supreme Court case could grant religious groups carte blanche to ignore the law. Today, American Atheists joined other secular organizations in filing an amicus brief in the Little Sisters of the Poor v. Pennsylvania case, one of the most important religious exemption cases before the U.S. Supreme Court this term. In the 2016 Supreme Court case, Zubik v. Burwell, religious organizations, including Little Sisters of the Poor, challenged the religious accommodation that had been carved out of the Affordable Care Act's contraceptive mandate. In order to exempt themselves from the obligation to provide health insurance that included no-cost contraception coverage, religious organizations were required to notify the government that they wished to be exempt by completing a half-page form. Little Sisters of the Poor, among others, argued that even this involved them too much in the quote-unquote sin of reproductive health.
And that's where our first disagreement comes in, is the facts of whether that's an accurate description of the requirement.
It seems to be based on the Pennsylvania versus President of the United States case, which is being appealed to the Supreme Court, which actually directly references the Zubik v. Burwell case,
Right.
in where they were challenging it. That being said, let me see where it was.
Because ultimately while you're looking up that, just to give some background, ultimately what this goes back to is the Affordable Care Act. And the Affordable Care Act, when it was passed, had some stipulations that preventative health care should be covered if the company was going to have a health plan that was considered to be compatible, or it met the requirements for them to not get charged whatever the penalties are. The company had to offer a health care plan that met those requirements. And preventative health care, through some decisions, was decided that it included reproductive health care or contraceptives underneath the health care plan. So a lot of religious organizations, specifically Hobby Lobby is one of the more famous, they contested this and said that, and the Hobby Lobby is not a religious group, but they do have a lot of religious leanings with their company. They felt that it would be in a violation of their beliefs to force them to pay for someone else's contraception under the requirements of preventative health care. So now we're getting back into this story, and I don't know if you had enough time to find what it was you were looking for, or if I should...
I did find what I was looking for. And It appears that this form does exist, and it is relatively short.
Okay. So the question is, what happened was the Trump administration created a rule that said that they were going to basically be exempt from filling out this form, correct? Is that what the rule was?
They were essentially, to me, whining about having to fill out this form.
Okay. So the question is this form notifying the government that they are not going to be providing reproductive health care or contraception through their health insurance, or is this form entangling the organization with their health insurance so that they can get a secondary health plan that is still underneath their actual healthcare provider, so that it does not make it where the company is paying for the coverages included in the contraception.
Okay, so the Public Health Service Act Section 2713 requires, among other things, that certain group health plans and issuers provide benefits for women's preventive services without cost sharing, as provided for in comprehensive guidelines supported by the Health Resources Services Administration, or HRSA. The HRSA guidelines provide an exemption for group health plans and student health insurance coverage established or maintained by entities that object to providing coverage for all or a subset of contraceptive services based on religious beliefs or moral convictions. However, an optional accommodation process is available for objecting entities that are exempt but choose to shift the otherwise applicable obligation to provide benefits for contraceptive services to its issuer or third-party administrator. So it seems as though it's an either or. They can choose to shift it to this optional accommodation or file for the exemption using this form, EBSA Form 700. Objecting entities should note that if their issuer has their own religious or moral objection to providing contraception services, an issuer may also avail themselves of this exemption. Separately, third-party administrators with an objection may also decline to enter or continue contracts as a TPA of the plan. So, this is really just a form. And it also says if you intend to utilize the optional accommodation process. So this is a essentially get out of jail free card. All they have to do is fill out this form.
What kind of questions does it ask on the form? Because I still
all it is asking is name of the objecting entity, name and title of the individual who is authorized to make and makes this certification on behalf of the entity, mailing and email addresses and phone number for the individual listed above, and sign the signature of the individual listed above and the date. That's it. And it is saying that I certify the organization is an objecting entity that has a sincerely held religious or moral objection to providing coverage for some or all of any contraceptive services.
So I think the area that right now we are on different pages on, and this is going to require me to look more into it before I know exactly what's going on, is I'm under the impression that once they have an exception and they exempt themselves, the insurance provider still works with that company to provide contraceptive coverage. It's just at no cost to the company. The insured takes on 100% of the cost of the premium. It's not included as part of their benefits, where there's how the company would pay for part of the premium.
Okay, so if it's a cost for contraception and whatnot, and it's still coming at no cost to the company, then they're not paying for it and they're not engaging in it.
Well, they are still deducting it from their paychecks, and they are still having it covered under their health insurance plan. It's just not.
That's something that is covered by the insurer, the insurance agency, not the company. If the company has an issue with that, then they need to take it up with their insurance company, and they have the option to switch insurance companies. That is not them engaging in it. That is the insurance company engaging in it. So they didn't do the religious organization, the religious business didn't do anything.
So it is
also okay. There's other issues as well. In fact, a watcher, my mother, chimes in, says her question for companies refusing to cover birth control pills is this: will you allow a woman to have them covered under the prescription drug plan for medical reasons? Some take them for reasons other than birth control reasons. And a very apropos question: if you won't give exemptions, then why should you receive any? There are several other uses for what are commonly labeled as birth control or contraceptive medications. Some for hormone balancing, There's one or two that have been used in the past. I don't know if they still are, but they have been used before as treatment for menopause, again for hormone balancing issues.
Right.
So these are still contraceptives. If they're not, would they be? Are they prepared to make an exemption in such an instance? And if not, why should they receive an exemption? I mean, one has been provided to them by the government for their religious grounds for the First Amendment issue, and I'm okay with that. But to start up a court case because you think that filling out a form implicates you in engaging in reproductive health is complete nonsense.
They didn't start the case. They petitioned to be included as petitioners. So they are arguing on behalf of it, but they didn't start it. The original case is because...
I'm just saying the case starting in general, not specifically Little Sisters of the Poor. Although this Little Sisters of the Poor v. Pennsylvania, this case is theirs, separate from the 2016 SCOTUS case of Zubik v. Burwell.
Yes.
So this is something that they have started.
Well, the actual case is Pennsylvania versus Trump.
Yes.
And Little Sisters versus Pennsylvania is because they want it to be included in on it, even though they weren't the original party.
Plaintiff, yeah.
Yeah.
But they're arguing for the same thing. That's the issue here.
They are arguing for the same thing, but a lot of it has to do with the kind of laws that Pennsylvania has wrote that says that you cannot have people, you cannot offer them services under a different insurance. So if they weren't going to offer it from their health insurance provider, that does not free the employee to start getting it through whatever the medical, not Medicare, but whatever the other government,
Medicaid or state.
Yeah. It doesn't
some level of state insurance and whatnot, yeah.
And it doesn't allow them to acquire this special coverage from a different insurance provider because the Pennsylvania law puts a burden onto the company that it all has to be under the same provider. So that's where things are coming in, is that instead of allowing the person to kind of go and get it themselves, it's forcing a requirement that the company maintains unity with its healthcare provider, even though it's a different healthcare plan because it's basically divorced from their other health benefits.
However, this is all information that would be required to be divulged to the employee prior to signing up for the payroll deduction for this insurance, correct?
I don't know what Pennsylvania laws are on it, unfortunately. Insurance laws.
Okay, so there are federal regulations for disclosure laws when it comes to health insurance and things like that. I'm pretty sure you got to put all your cards on the table, no matter what. There may be state level nuance attached to all this, but the entire policy, as well as any affiliated state legislation that would potentially interfere with that, would have to be divulged.
Right.
So at that point, then the employee makes a decision. Either, okay, I go with my employer payroll deduct health insurance, knowing that I will not receive this type of care or coverage, and because of the state I live in, somehow I'm not able to seek it elsewhere, aside from purchasing out of pocket. Or they have the choice to seek coverage on the exchange or purchase coverage on an individual plan. Or they have the opportunity to say, I don't like either option, I need to start looking for another job.
Yeah. My understanding is that that the company does not have the opportunity to offer that. That's an offer they can't make. It has to be all or nothing.
However, the Little Sisters of the Poor case, this has not been talking about whether or not they can offer the third party administration of it. This is just nothing.
Yeah, I did read another article that gave a little bit more detail about what the actual question at play is.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever I looked through that and a couple of other briefs, it did not seem like anywhere said that filling out the half-page form was one of the questions of the case. There's basically 2 questions of the case, and none of them have to do with the paperwork itself.
Hang on.
Because one of them is a more technical question of whether or not Pennsylvania can block Little Sisters of the Poor from being involved in the case. And then one of them has to do with the nature of the president's exemption that he extended. And I didn't read enough into it to really understand what that question was. But it seems like what happened is when Pennsylvania was implementing its state law, it had changed it numerous times. And so it kind of created this sliding scale of what the requirements were. And it keeps going back to basically they have to become entangled with the insurance company and providing some kind of solution to the employee instead of just being exempt from it and then allowing the employee to get their coverage from wherever.
Let's see.
I think if the form simply was just, I am the healthcare administrator and our plan doesn't cover this, and you were sending it to like the, attorney general's office for the state, I would probably be on your side. If it was just simple and shut and that's all it was a notification that we aren't providing the coverage and it kind of frees the person to get that, I'd probably be on the same side with you. But how I read it, that's just not the impression I was getting. I could be wrong.
I think you might be incorrect on this because a lot of the argumentation, point blank, seems to be that with the advent of the Affordable Care Act, many patients switch from a cheaper, less effective contraceptive method to a more effective, expensive method that was better for their medical health and personal needs. So this is to also prevent so it looks like Little Sisters of the Poor is trying to get in just to remove their liability from filling out the form. That's what they are trying to do. However, the overarching case, including that, is primarily to do with the potential abuse of this exemption because an executive order from Donald Trump overwhelmingly expanded it to just anyone who had an objection to it. Because it instituted 2 entirely different exemptions. One is the religious exemption. The other is what is considered, quote unquote, the moral exemption.
Yeah.
It doesn't really go into detail on that. And so that's why Little Sisters of the Poor is trying to get on this. Is yeah, a lot of this is states going after the executive order because in doing this, it's going to cause a massive resurgence and put a burden on the states, state health care for women coming back to them to receive this kind of coverage, to receive this kind of care.
Yeah,
So it's not just Pennsylvania, it's also Massachusetts, California, New Jersey. So this is them coming after um, the executive order, from the looks of it, for vastly expanding what an exemption is, and they're trying to curtail that to what it actually was to begin with.
Now, the question about what is the moral objection, I would
Little
not
Sisters of the
be
Poor
surprised.
on this, based on what I can find here, sorry to interrupt, seems to be they're arguing that it's unduly burdensome to fill out this form. This form, which consists of 3 boxes, a signature line, and a date line.
And that's what it's describing as unduly burdensome.
Yes, that's the Little Sisters of the Poor are alleging.
And who does that form get submitted to? Does it say on the form?
It's ESBA Form 700. So this is submitted to the U.S. Department of Labor.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah, if that's it, that they fill that form
That's
out,
why they are getting involved. That's not the reason why this case is happening. This is their specific involvement and attempted involvement. That's what this article is about, and I think that's probably where some confusion may have come in for your part, because
yeah.
there's this whole big other issue that's attached to it.
So then, in that case, yeah, I don't really know why it would need to be a big deal if it's just filling out a form.
Right. So
the case itself is about way more than a form, and I definitely understand why the case is an issue, but that's not why Little Sisters of the Poor are apparently involved in it.
Right. So Little Sisters of the Poor, among others, argued that even filling out EBSA Form 700 was somehow involving them too much in the sin of contraceptive coverage. So now they're apparently trying to take a second bite at the apple. In its current case against the states of Pennsylvania and New Jersey, they allege once again that merely providing this notice to the government is a substantial burden on their religious exercise. This form is a substantial burden. I don't see it. And so this is where I find myself once again in overwhelming agreement with American Atheists on this one. And I would think that they would not get something that insanely wrong and then also file a 38-page brief on it as a complaint against it.
So American Atheists provided that 38-page brief, or is that a copy of the brief that was submitted to the Supreme Court that describes the facts of the case?
No, this is American Atheist amicus brief that has been submitted as a complaint against Little Sisters of the Poor, Saints Peter and Paul Home, specifically.
Okay.
No constitutional right to an exemption. Petitioner cannot demonstrate a substantial burden on his religious beliefs. Petitioner's case does not concern a burden on religious liberty, but rather an attempt to legislate through the courts. And the government has a compelling interest in ensuring the widespread availability of contraceptive services to women. So this is their participation in Pennsylvania and New Jersey versus Donald Trump in regard to the Little Sisters of the Poor organization. Yeah. According to American Atheist Council, Blackwell, Little Sisters of the Poor claim that filing paperwork somehow involves them in sin and distant complicity makes no sense. Even if LPO, LSOTP truly believed this, the court can and should find that mailing in a piece of paper is in no way a substantial burden on anyone's religious expression. Were the Supreme Court to rule otherwise, the term substantial burden, legally speaking, would lose all meaning, and the court would open the floodgates to even more absurd claims. This I wholeheartedly agree with. Because if that was allowed to be considered unduly or substantially burdensome, and they were able to successfully file for some form of legal or injunctive relief, yeah, that would render that phrase meaningless. And not just Supreme Court, but across the country, that term would become meaningless.
So,
and then there'd be even a greater need for tort reform to find another term that better describes that.
let me ask you a question that has nothing to do with this case or religion directly.
Okay.
Just I'm curious about taking one of these ideas and running with it. And if this gets cut, then whatever. But
we're live, dude. Nothing gets cut.
Okay. Well, if they were to say that you need to fill out a half-page form for each one of your guns so that you can have it maintained as that you have it and it's on file, would that be considered a substantial impediment or difficulty?
If I went and purchased a firearm, I already had to do that, and it's more than half a page.
No, for ones you already have. Maybe ones that you inherited. You plan on keeping it, you have to fill out a form for
if I inherit something through a will, then I already have to fill out a form 4473 for it. It's part of the transfer process.
Gift?
Through estate law. And so at that point, I already have to fill out a form.
What if it's gifted to you?
If it's gifted to me, these are entirely separate things, though.
They are separate things.
In fact, they have nothing to do with each other. Like, we have a right to bear arms. We have the Second Amendment.
Yeah.
Now, as far as whether or not a national registry of firearms, technically, that's actually not expressly an infringement of the Second Amendment. I vehemently disagree with it. I would not want to be subjected to such a thing. I would consider that an invasion of my privacy, as to it's not the government's business how much of what I own if it's legal for me to own it.
Right. Now, what was the term that we used about the form? It was a substantial...
It was a substantial burden or unduly burdensome. Those terms are almost interchangeable.
Right. So, substantial burden. And I'm not discussing birth control. I'm not even discussing gun rights. This is more of a question about situational legal ethics. If the form was for possession of weapons that you already own, and they forced you to fill that out in order to keep a weapon, would that be a substantial burden in that situation?
Filling out a half page, if I have no other choice but to fill this out? No, that's not a substantial burden.
Okay. I know a lot of people that would argue that it is. Because
if you're already subject to the law at that point, and you wish to maintain legal possession, then filling out that form is not a substantial burden.
I'm on the other side. I would argue that it would be, because your Second Amendment rights are more important than it. So there is nothing that the form would do that would, if you filled it out, any extra steps would be an infringement upon your Second Amendment rights. So it would be a substantial burden.
But if this form is already mandatory, at that point, the infringement has already occurred. And so the form itself is not a further infringement or substantially burdensome or unduly burdensome. It's the infringement. It's the national registry at that point that has become the infringement,
Yeah.
not the paperwork.
And I guess the only
So
reason,
that's that. I understand trying to attack it at every possible point
yeah,
to get it overturned. I understand that. However, filling out a piece of paperwork when there's already a national registry being put in place at that point, you're not going to get rid of that paperwork without getting rid of national registry as a whole. So
yeah.
there's no other way around that.
And,
So going after that particular piece of paperwork, eh, even if you were to get that in court and accepted and ruled on in a positive light of yes, it is burdensome and you shouldn't have to do it, all that does is make it where they go from registration to confiscation.
right. Yeah, I get where you're coming from on it. I guess the only reason that I wanted to bring that thought example up was, because what we're talking about would be the Second Amendment rights is obviously constitutional rights. First Amendment rights, freedom of religion, constitutional rights. And what we're talking about here is whether
We're
or
not
not,
actually talking about religious expression. We're actually talking about an employee-employer relationship. This is outside of religious expression because that religious organization has now deemed fit to engage in business by having employees that they are liable to pay for or that they are liable to pay. And
but the
so as far as charity organizations go and things like that. So I think that's where the issue kind of comes into play. However, this exemption has been put in place for them.
yeah,
So it was not. I even disagree with the fact that it was considered an infringement for their insurance to cover that, considering that based on most available data, even from sources outside of organizations like Planned Parenthood, 90 to 95% of all birth control medications are not used for birth control.
right.
They're used for other health issues, for other uh, health related complications and things like that. So that's none of the business of that religious organization.
Well, if that's the case, wouldn't those fall under the actual medical coverage for those conditions and not under contraceptive coverage? I guess
No,
it's an
because
interest.
those are still they're still in large part those drugs were designed as contraceptives. So no matter what, it's going to have a contraceptive effect.
I'm just wondering on how it gets billed for the insurance, whether it gets billed as a prescription for medical purposes or if it's billed as a contraceptive.
Well, at that point, it's not elective coverage. And the forms of birth control that people are pursuing is prescription. So
I had a, I know this is kind of chasing a rabbit, but I had a weird situation with my annual checkup
mhm.
this year where I went to the hospital and had a series of tests done. And it was supposed to fall under my checkup tests, which would have been 100% covered. But because I'm not in my 40s, the tests were considered elective instead of annual necessary.
Mhm.
And so, like, they were billed differently with the insurance company, even though it's the exact same test. It's a preventative test for my annual checkup, but instead of being a preventative, it was considered like an elective.
And that's just how their billing department operates then.
Yeah. And
So
I'm
different
wondering,
hospitals view different tests as different levels of necessity.
well, the
And that
hospital
generally
saw it
comes
as,
in and that generally comes into play usually, not saying it's all the time, but usually this comes into play when there's already, excuse me, another test that does this same thing, but
Yeah.
this one is just to get a slightly better read.
Yeah.
And so that's why, yeah. And okay, so according to my mom, who has taken medication like this in the past before, because almost every woman in this country has taken some form of birth control at some point,
Okay.
and that it is filed as a prescription straight up, and that's it. So
Oh, there you go.
it's just prescription drug coverage at that point.
Yeah.
And so this is them specifically targeting a certain class of drugs, a certain class of prescription medication, merely because of the effect it has.
So if you would
And
have
in
gotten,
fact, there's no biblical evidence to anything that I can find with any religion that I've encountered that actually states you shouldn't take it. You shouldn't take some form of contraceptive because the concept didn't exist when these books were written.
well,
These are practices. This is not doctrine. These are
I,
practices being touted as doctrine.
that would be interesting to look into different religions and see, because I think I can think of one or two of them.
Christianity doesn't have an argument. I'll say that
Okay.
much.
At least not mainstream Christianity based upon the Bible.
Right. Christianity based upon the Bible doesn't have anything. I would even go so far as to argue that Judaism, since they use a portion of the Bible, well, they
It would
neither
all
here
be
nor there. They're a religion that's older than Christianity.
there
So
is
Abraham, huh?
nothing about
What?
there is nothing in the New Testament about contraceptives.
There's nothing in the Old Testament as far as I've ever found about contraceptives. In fact, if you go back and read Numbers chapter 5, if a guy suspects his wife has cheated on him, he takes her to the temple, they force her to drink a potion, and if she miscarries, she's guilty. How is that not an abortion? In fact, how
Uh,
is that not a biblically endorsed abortion?
so that sounds like it probably would be. Yeah, I am not familiar with that particular scripture. I was thinking more along the lines of the story of Onan, which a lot of people would know.
Go back and read the book of Numbers, chapter 5.
Okay, I'll take that as a homework assignment.
Yeah. So we're reaching the hour 15 mark, and so I think we're going to go ahead and try and dial it back here, and we won't get into the final story for this evening. However, the link is still in the description down below, so please, if you would like to go read it, go read it. Otherwise, I will roll that one over to next week's show, and we will cover it then.
There was a final story.
Yeah, there was one more after
Huh.
this one. But we had some really good conversation going about this one and the one just prior to this. So
Yeah.
we're just gonna roll over the last one. And we come to our big announcement as far as this goes. So, and I hope everyone is really paying attention to this one here. And that is, Harry and I are embarking on what is going to be a several part kind of, I'm not going to say investigative journalism or anything like that, because I'm not a journalist, Harry's not a journalist. We're two schmucks in Texas that are doing this as a hobby more than anything else. However, we don't see a ton of coverage on this, and so we feel a more in-depth look is needed into this organization. And that is the Happy Science Organization. They've been around for almost 40 years, since 1986, to be precise. And so there's going to be I think we had settled on a 5-part series. Let me check to be sure.
You said 86 or 76?
86.
Okay.
Right, a 5-part series talking about happy science in depth, since they have established and continue to establish more of a foothold here in the United States. And personally, I see this as maybe not necessarily becoming a problem here in the U.S. However, they did have problems in their home country of Japan, that involved being targeted, even attacked by a known terrorist organization. And also potentially having some less than above board ties themselves. And so we're going to take a look into this cult, and we're going to show everybody what we find. It'll be a 5-part series. Each video will be somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes. That's the idea. And so, all said and told, it'll be about an hour and a half total of watch time. This is going to take us some time. I am hoping to be able to release this sometime in the next couple of months. However, once it's ready to go, we'll start releasing them a video at a time, spaced 1 week apart, so that people can kind of get an idea and have time to watch it, look into things for themselves, and digest the information they've been given. I think that's the best way to go about it, and the best way to not just create a draw for the channel, but also to kind of show people what we can do editing wise, looking at some shorter form video content, since that seems to be the way that YouTube is going. However, this will not infringe upon the Sunday service, nor will it infringe upon the Discussions with a Theist show. The Discussions with a Theist show happens as often as it can with as many people as it can. So those are typically on Saturdays, and of course the Sunday show happens every Sunday. All right, anything you want to leave the people with, Harry?
I joined all the happy science groups I could find on Facebook, and we'll see if I can start attending any of their meetings, either online or in person. I'm pretty sure we don't have any of them subscribed and following to us right now. And
not to my knowledge.
Video until after we get done, but I'm going to go in and I'm going to join up for a little while if I can.
Okay. Now, don't forget we still have other research we have to do on this, and yeah, we're hoping to have all this content together for you real soon. And if this is something that y'all like, please leave a comment down below if this is something that interests you, and we will endeavor to do more in-depth research videos and video series on cults in America. We'll just call it that. I don't know if that name's taken, so hopefully it isn't. If it is, we'll figure out something to call it. So, hope everybody looks forward to seeing it. We will see y'all next week. Bye, everybody.